Well, to your point, poetry really is, when you start really reading poetry, it is literally like learning another language, right? So I've had like these different phases in my life. Like I remember when I was on the train when I was a teenager and I first started reading, and I just had the happy idea of let me pick up Vladimir Lenin's The State and Revolution. And I was trying to read that on the train. And I remember 45 minutes passed from Coney Island to Times Square. That's the length of the trip. And I was sitting there reading the same paragraph over and over again. I'm like, what the fuck is this? I don't understand anything that's going on. Am I really just this stupid? How can I be this stupid? I'm not illiterate. I don't understand what's going on. So I was like, all right, if this is too hard, let me try something else. So I came home and I started with Leon Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed on his critique of Stalinism. And what I did with that book was I went through every single paragraph, and I did this like for a couple weeks straight. I went through every single paragraph in the book. I had index cards, and I would summarize each paragraph in my own words. I did this for every single paragraph in the book, and then out of curiosity, 2 weeks later, I cracked open The State and Revolution, and I'm literally reading it a paragraph, normally, like it's a fucking novel. And I was like, holy, I've had such a transformation, like something just literally just totally changed in my brain over 2 weeks just by this process.
Today, I get to talk to Alex Sheremet, who is a poet, film critic, filmmaker, and has a film coming out this year about the life of Bruce Ario, who is a Minneapolis poet who passed away last year. So, we're going to be talking about some of those things. So, Alex, welcome.
Hello. And just as a quick correction, Bruce was adamant about his name being pronounced Ario as an A-I-R, as if it's air, Ario. And his poetic form is called the Ario poetic form.
Oh, that is that is good to know. Huh, okay. Um, Yeah, well, thank you. So I wanted to ask you about your background because I noticed you have a lot of things going on with your YouTube channel, your website, and poetry. So what's all on your plate?
Well, I guess we could sort of take it back to the very beginning. I was born in Belarus, then USSR, and I came to New York City for the first grade. Actually, I started learning English in the first grade here. And I've mostly lived in New York City for most of my life. And when I was a teenager, I fell into literature by way of there was this book, Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver, which I sort of just stumbled upon accidentally. He was a co-founder of the Black Panther Party. And although I don't really think too highly of the book now, when I was 16 years old, it was a major kind of transformative point for me. And soon after that, I came across things like Countee Cullen's poetry. Countee Cullen was a Harlem Renaissance poet. I would argue he's the best of the Harlem Renaissance poets, and maybe one of the two or three best Black poets, period, alongside James Emmanuel. And I hope to actually do a film on him sometime in the future. And I just thought reading this poem by Cullen called Heritage that I don't know why this poem is such a great poem, but I know it's a great poem. And that to me was a real revelation. The idea that when it comes to poetry, there is going to be some sort of hierarchy which exists, and there's a hierarchy to respect. And even if people's hierarchies might be different from person to person, there's still always something to work towards. And I remember just very distinctly feeling, I just know, this is well crafted poetry, and I want to figure out why. So eventually it was just, I was writing poems. I did a couple of novels. I did a very big book of film criticism called Woody Allen Reel to Reel. And it happened just literally a few years after a thought crossed my mind, which was these other people that I'm interacting with now, they're also interested in the arts, but they're also really interested in film. But to me, that's too much time, right? It takes too much time. I don't have the energy to focus on everything, including film. But before you knew it, within a few years, I had the biggest book on Woody Allen ever written. So it just sort of told me that all these stories that we tell ourselves are just bullshit, aren't they? Right? If you want to learn about film and become a critic, you could do that. If 10 years later you want to be a filmmaker without training, you could do that. You're going to have to really find a way to make it work. You're going to have to take it seriously, but you could do that. So on top of that, I do have a literary magazine. That's automachination.com. Bruce Ario actually wrote for it. He submitted a few pieces, and this was shortly before his unfortunate death. It was unexpected in August of 2022. And after that happened, I was like, all right, so we have people interested in literature. We're trying to do things that are just not really commercial, but just we want to focus on things that we believe in. And we might as well do a film on Bruce because nobody else would. As time goes on, fewer people will know who he is. So it's either now or never. We have to go to Minneapolis, get the footage, talk to people that were in his life, and just get something out there. So that's kind of the genesis of the film and some of the things that I do in general.
Yeah, cool. Oh man, there's a lot of questions I have. One of the things you touched on is something I was on my list of things to ask you about of just poetry. You talked about there being how did you phrase that? An objective measure of goodness as opposed to anything
Hmm.
can be anything.
Hmm.
What have you learned about what actually makes a good poem, and why is good poetry so hard to describe?
Well, to get back to the example of a Countee Cullen and heritage, so the poem came at a time when I was losing my religion. Right? I used to be an Eastern Orthodox Christian, and then by the time that I was a teenager, I was becoming more skeptical. And Countee Cullen, he was a religious poet, right? He was a theological poet, and he had this complex about being a Black American with all the objective oppressions that he was facing then, and also the fact that he was a Christian and he knew that this was a religion that was given to him by his enslavers. And he also had this emotional attachment to Africa and to the notion that there are pagan gods and they have their beliefs. And the way that he structures the poem is it begins in this kind of really almost romantic set of notions about Africa, right? Almost as if like he is presenting a myth to you. He is presenting a myth to you, right? It's the Afrocentric myth, right? That was eventually popularized in, the 60s and 70s. The whole, we was Kangs kind of meme thing going on, except he was a little more focused on, I guess, less overt, Afrocentric concerns and more of the kind of the questions of like, this would just be my experience if I was born elsewhere. So he sort of starts giving you the myth in a kind of unexpected way, but the individual lines of the myth, they're very memorable. Like for instance, when he starts talking about the animals of prey in Africa, he has a couplet: "Cry that monarch claws have leapt from the scabbards where they slept." Right? This idea that the king of the jungle, whoever it might be, that this just like thinking, let me present these myths in a way that's a little bit different from what people might hear. And then he makes the transition into discussing how he personally feels saved by Jesus Christ. And then the final part of the poem, which is totally unexpected, was this expression of self-hatred, this expression of, well, I want my God to be Black too. How do I deal with this? And these parts don't seem to very logically go together, right? These are not the kinds of things that an activist would say, right? Activists would have less room for nuance, right? Because they need to make things happen as opposed to think about their own position in the world, think about, and just kind of like self-reflect on, perhaps more abstracted concerns. So poetry that's able to bring all these things together in unexpected and subtle ways, right? That creates, or rather, it removes, right, the ceiling to artistic greatness. Countee Cullen could have been, some ordinary theological poet. Bruce Ario, he was a religious Christian. He could have also been an ordinary theological poet where it's just kind of like, I don't know, songs to Jesus that are just very predictable and rote. There's no, me not having religion. I personally don't make any distinctions when I'm reading. Like I have very clear set of political beliefs and whatnot, but I don't really pick and choose in terms of, well, I don't agree with this guy's political viewpoint, so this is bad writing, or I'm not religious and I find this offensive, so I don't care about that, right? There's good and bad way beyond my personal opinions, right? Which is kind of like the point here, right? You always want to bring yourself out of it as much as you can, whatever you might emotionally feel. And I think emotions are good when you let the brain take control, right? There's a very easy way to sort of hit upon emotions by going through the brain first. And little by little, this is just kind of how I've trained myself, right? I don't normally, weep over sad things that might happen to me, but if I'm in a certain mood and I read a line of Herman Melville and Moby Dick, I'm definitely gonna have tears in my eyes because it's hitting the brain, right? It's hitting the brain first. If I feel like an artist is manipulating me, trying to pull on my heartstrings, but without actually doing any real work to make that happen, immediately I'm going to hold them at arm's length, right? I don't trust that, right? I need my brain tickled first before I guess before we could get to the tears and whatnot.
Oh man, that sounds very subtle. The difference between manipulation and you actually put in the work, like you're saying with Herman Melville. Um, Man, I guess that's I get good poetry by nature is hard to describe like
Hmm.
in set terms like what the difference is. It's funny like I so my background I'm not I don't consider myself a well-read in a lot of poetry, but I did take a lot of English classes, which was an interesting experience for judging poetry because you read a lot of poems and some of them just stick with you. And like I really can't explain why, but I just happen to remember like a good line, a good expression. Some poems I just remembered, and then some I just completely forgot. So to me, that's my measure of uh, the good poems. Like, oh, well, there must have been something there that resonated with me on some deeper level that I can't describe, but that's what it is. So,
Yeah, and I don't think that's a totally bad metric, at least in the sense that, if we look at the long view, historically speaking, better things tend to win out over a long period of time. Now, there are some exceptions, which I personally don't get. Like, I don't get why Jeffrey Chaucer is so popular among, some readers. To me, it's kind of boring. It doesn't seem to be very well crafted. But that's that. But generally speaking, many of the classics of Greek literature, of Roman literature, even if I disagree with some of the classic status in terms of like, I would think that certain books might be better compared to the stuff that is sort of bandied about as the classic and whatnot. But still, like with enough passage of time, things that are more timeless and are more universal, they tend to stick around, right? So I definitely do seek out things that make me really remember what's done. But it's also kind of tricky, right? Because to get to some of those subtleties again, for you to get to the point of that being, an acceptable metric, you sort of do have to do like a sufficient amount of reading, right? Like the kinds of things that would really stick with me now versus what stuck with me when I was 16, reading Saul and Ice and similar books, it's very different. Right. With enough training, I was able to go back to some of these kind of like early childhood literary heroes, whether it was Eldridge Cleaver or people like Vladimir Nabokov, and I could read them over again and say, well, I can recognize these objective flaws because I've done so much other reading. And I could see that they didn't quite, finagle this, or they're engaging in, like a paragraph of cliches here, or this or that political insight. Not only is it not really well written, but it's also dated, right? So it didn't even stand the test of time in terms of just being just nakedly correct, right? Because that's another thing. I would much rather read people like politically that turn out to be wrong on any number of issues, as long as they are great craftsmen. Because with great craft, what you'll notice is even if you disagree with some of the things that are said, there's so much room and so much open-endedness that you could really construct many other positions based on their statements simply because they're so well made. And I think Nietzsche is a great example. Now, I'm very, very far on the left, but I'm also a huge fan of Nietzsche. I'm not afraid of his fascistic tendencies. I'm not afraid of the fact that he's had all these negative comments about socialists. That to me doesn't really matter because when I read like the best of the stuff and how well it's crafted, I can construct so many political projects based on, everything that's between the lines and not just the lines themselves. So that's another thing with great art. there's a lot less to fear ideologically. It really, if you really let yourself go when it comes to like really accepting like great art in your life, you'll notice that you'll become a far less rigid ideological person in that way.
Ooh, yeah, that's interesting. So you brought up politics a bit, and I was meaning to ask you at some point the role of politics in this, because I always hesitate to bring up anything political, because I feel like our natural tendency is someone says something political, and then the tribal mindset kicks in, and you are driven to that ideological state where it's like you've dug your trench and you're going to fight to the death, sort of thing. Um, so I guess what but you say but so how do you square that with with having strong political opinions that you want to express, but not falling into the tribal problem?
I have to be honest in the sense that I have not ever fully reconciled my strong political leanings, which are, they are the origin of these like deeper interests in the arts, right? It wasn't art. Well, it was kind of hard to say, right? Because I was first drawn, I guess, through rap, right? Through hip hop. Like I really loved the fact that when it came to rappers I was listening to in the 90s and the early 2000s, they were very emphatic that there are rappers with talent and there's rappers with no talent, and we're going to battle and we're going to figure out what's what in that regard. They were never shy in the same way that academics might be shy these days, that are like, oh yeah, we don't want to establish a hierarchy between this writer and that writer, Shakespeare, or whoever else. Like, we don't want to do that. If in the rap world, if you have much deeper, masculine stakes, which often in these kinds of neighborhoods just literally end in death. You don't really have time for this kind of bullshit of we're not going to establish hierarchies because we're ensconced in academia and doesn't really matter. Right. We could just, if we don't have hierarchies in this way, we could pat each other on the back and we could do favors for one another a lot more easily. If I don't have to say that your book of poetry is shit, you don't have to say that my book of poetry is shit. Right. That's a lot harder to pull off like in the South Bronx or, in Brooklyn, and where a lot of this music would tend to first come from. So I haven't really fully reconciled the two, because honestly, sometimes when I do like a ton of like political content on YouTube, I'm like, damn, I feel so dirty. I need to make sure that the next like X number of video clips that I, clip out, it's like some show that I'm doing on Shakespeare, or like some, like something that's like art related. And it's just like, we're analyzing the lines one by one. Because it's difficult, right? And people don't have the attention span for that. And I want to resist that, right? In the same way that I resist certain things that I consider to be politically unjust, I think it is so unjust that when it comes to like the human attention spans, they've been so whittled away, and people just don't want to do this kind of hard work. It doesn't titillate them enough. I find that really horrible, right? Going forward for humanity. Like I honestly don't even know if books are going to really be selling, a couple decades from now. Is there going to be really a lot of opportunity for the same kind of writing that we had? I feel very much like a 20th century man, right, in the 21st century. And I remember when I first started reading, and it was like, oh, that's what James Baldwin did. He was sort of writing essays for himself, and then some guy at the Atlantic discovered him and said, hey, that's a really talented kid. Let's bring him on. That doesn't happen anymore, right? But I'm still kind of operating as if it ought to be. I'm kind of living my life, right? Like if you don't want to this 3 hour video on Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, if you don't want this 5 hour video when we go through every chapter of Nietzsche's The Gay Science, fuck you. I'm still going to cram it down your throat. Even if it doesn't get the clicks like, a Norman Finkelstein video might, or whatever else that I might do. It's just like you have to make those selections, right? So it's, I can't say that I fully reconciled, but as time goes on, it is becoming sort of easier to see where I personally fit, in some of this stuff.
Ah. Okay, so two interesting points that I'm trying to reconcile. On the one hand, when we were talking about the good poetry surviving, I got the impression that good poetry is going to survive because of the collective opinion of people. It's the poetry that lasts, and time is going to show what is actually good. And then what you said here was our attention spans are getting shorter. Or like we don't know if we're going to buy books in the future. So how do you put those two together? Do we have
Well,
is it going
yeah,
uphill or downhill?
I'm thinking more so in the short term, right?
Mm,
I have no, I have no kind of skepticism about the idea that with enough time, like a lot of this stuff will be rediscovered, right? There's only so much, dope you can smoke before you get dope sick, right? There's only so
mm,
much, so many TikToks you could watch before it's like, I remember like, I used to have like bad phone habits all the time. And it's like eventually I literally got tired, right? I got tired of looking at, random stuff. I got tired of all this nonsense. And I started actually the YouTube channel again because there was a point in my life for a few years where I was working on, so many other things. And I found that a lot of time passed and I had not read like real fiction in a long time or like real poetry in a long time. And I was like, I need to escape this. So, like books will never disappear in the sense that yeah, we could imagine the disappearance of music, or we could imagine the disappearance of a whole lot of stuff from human culture. But if you make books disappear, suddenly it's like we don't really have human civilization as we know it, right? The fact that writing is so abstract and is so tight and can say so much in a single paragraph, much more, right, than I think like a film could, much more than an infographic could, just like a great paragraph of prose or a great page of poetry. It does so much, and that sort of thing can never actually, be fully killed off. And I am an optimist when it comes to human destiny. I think we definitely have, dips in various events, right? I believe that the world is becoming less violent overall, for example, at least when it comes to human beings. But you can't simply point to World War II and say that that negates the thesis. It doesn't, right? Because 5 centuries ago, you had that quite a bit too. The An-Lushan Rebellion, the end of the Tang Dynasty in China, killed high estimates could be as high as a third of the Chinese population, which was the most populous country in the world at the time. So things really do come in fits and starts. And long term, I'm not worried, but it is annoying to be living in the 21st century as a 20th century man.
no. Yeah, that makes sense. The long term uphill, the short term downhill. Out of curiosity, have you read Steven Pinker's book on what was it called? Oh shoot, it was a better.
Better Angels of Asia. Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I have read it. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I know that there have been people, throwing dirt on some of the statistics, some people that deny that things were ever as violent. But I mean, I think the best objection that I saw was something like a 2.5% fatality rate as a murder rate was probably closer to the, prehistoric average than something like 15%, which is what he cites. And to put that in perspective, I haven't done the math on this in a while, but I did at some point, and I was kind of shocked to realize that depending on the neighborhood that you look at, a 2.5% murder rate is meaning like per lifetime of an individual is roughly equivalent to the murder rate of black males in certain black neighborhoods. Okay. That is an incredible number if you think about it, right? And many of the kids that I knew, for like I went to a majority black high school, many of the kids that I knew, they would very casually talk about, oh yeah, I had a friend that died a year ago. I had a girl died 6 months ago. I grew up with this or that person, and they died when I was a child. I saw my first body when I was 8 or 9. It's kind of like if you walk down the street. Imagine, in every single block, every single year, like somebody dying due to, let's just call it some kind of blood feud, right? Every single year, somebody dies in your block due to a blood feud. Eventually, that sort of thing could easily reach you. And so 2.5% versus 15, yeah, it is a drastic difference, assuming we even can see that 2.5% is the right number, but it's still horrible. And it's not a number that, a place like Japan, for instance, would ever even conceptualize, at least in the modern world, right? They would never have a murder rate that high. It wouldn't, it just would not be within, even like for like white people in, many places in America. It's just so far outside of their imagination that, people could live this way. So, and just like putting a lot of these things together, my own experiences, it really does seem like the ancient world, it just had to be much more violent, just based on what we know about collective punishment and having like a place that you go to get your justice from, right? If you can do this, as Pinker argues, not through a blood feud, but through a neutral third party, that is obviously, going to be better. And, when you look at things like cowboy violence in the Wild West, it's like, we're talking about 200 or 300 per 100,000 per year, right? Which is about 4 or 5 times as bad as the worst neighborhood in America, right? So I accept this thesis, even though I have a lot of misgivings about Pinker himself. I think with the later book, I did like a 5 hour show on Enlightenment Now, where a lot of it is just apologia for, again, I agree with the trajectory that in general we're going up. But if you're somebody like a Pinker and you're making these kinds of books, it really does incentivize you to, when we're on the clear kind of dip or stagnation, you really undersell that dip and that stagnation,
Mm.
right? In the same, that's one reason why I don't vote for the two parties. It's not so much that I'm ideologically opposed to voting Democrat, for instance. I'm not. But if I see time and time again the worst candidates on offer, I know that we've hit on a moment, extended period of stagnation that was not the case in the 30s or even in the 50s and 60s. So I have to, employ some strategy about that. And I think Pinker very much undersells exactly the magnitude of the dips, and he also undersells the fact that he's talking about human beings, right? And we're not thinking about the animals that were causing extinction, right? We're not talking about climate damage, and he views climate change, and he would pay the lip service to it, but not in a way that really underscores what is probably going to happen, which is probably we will have hundreds of millions at least of climate refugees, and everything that entails in terms of armed militant movements or inequality, or suddenly, human development index just cratering, even if it's only for a few decades, still cratering before it goes back up, right? Those things are all on the table, and I think they are going to happen.
Oh, man, I didn't realize you had such in-depth thoughts on Steven Pinker. I've only read that one book, and I thought it was an interesting point. So, yeah, man, that's interesting. Um, but I want to bring it back to Bruce Ario and the film. It's coming out this year, and you sent me the first 8 minutes of it,
Mhm.
and in that 8 minutes, I was struck by the interplay between poetry and visuals. And this is a bit of a side story for me, but I love classical music. I've always loved it, and I've always been in the Romantic era, the 1900s. I love that. And then, but I always heard people talking about Mahler, and Mahler was a little later. And I tried listening to Mahler, and it just never made any sense to me. Like I can kind of see, the notes are going up and down, but like it didn't click for me until I saw a YouTube video where they took Mahler's Fifth Symphony and they put it to nothing special. It was like random movie clips that kind of matched the tone of the music. And that's all it was. It was a really simple video, but it was like 5 minutes long going along with this Fifth Symphony. And when I watched that, I noticed later like that would come back to me, and I actually like started liking the song because of the visuals that were attached to it. And so now like I love that song, and it was like a gateway because it allowed me to appreciate Mahler's other music. And so like the
Mhm.
video didn't matter at that point because I'd already liked it. Like it already sold me on what the vision of the music was. So now I love Mahler, and it was all thanks to that one video that just had the right presentation. And so it reminded me of what your film's doing here with Bruce Ario, in that like I was looking over his poetry, and I could kind of some of them stood out to me more than others, and some of them I just thought like I don't get this. But I'm holding out the possibility that if it's presented in a certain fashion, then it'll make sense to me. Like the music of the words will click for me just in the same way that Mahler did. So that's why I'm interested in your film in particular, because I know that film medium can have a powerful impact.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, because when we were in the planning stages of like creating a master list of the poems that would make it in, or just like structurally, right? What is this film going to look like? I was just kind of like rereading the Cityboy novel of Bruce Ario, and I was rereading his selected poems, and we're just like not only pulling apart the poems and the passages that would make it into the film, but also automatically thinking what visuals would really make some of this click. And it doesn't have to click in the sense of we are recapping what is happening in the poem in the footage, because I think that's just kind of boring. In fact, as we were sitting down to the planning stages, one thing that Jill Parrish, who's my co-director here, we're splitting everything, 50-50 in terms of responsibilities. He was telling me, I was watching this documentary on the poetry of Sylvia Plath just to get some ideas. And every single time that a poem talking about wind or trees or anything might come across, like they just give you images of the breeze, they're giving you images of the tree, they're giving you images of everything that's coming up in the poem. And you can't do that for like a full-length film, and you probably can't even do it for a 30-minute documentary because it gets very old really fast, and it creates this very unfortunate tension where poetry, right, which is supposed to be subtle and supposed to be really combining disparate elements together. Um, on the one hand, that's happening in the poem, and yet here you have a film that is so prosaic, right? That's doing nothing but recap, recap, recap. So you have to avoid that. So if you notice, for instance, there's like little things happening, like when the narrator, which is so if you hear the two voices, right, the male voice is always going to be Bruce Ario's poetry or prose. The female voice is a narrator that's like our screenplay, right, that we put together for the sake of the film. And you have things going on like something like we're talking about there being like there's like no people out on the street just yet, right? Because it's not sunrise yet, and yet you're seeing like a night scene. You're hearing something about the lights blinking off one after the other, and yet the lights they're on, right? But we sort of make them askance by just showing you the lights in a puddle, right? Which sort of like differentiates it a bit. Or even like at the very beginning, right? We have a de facto birth scene where it's just Bruce Ario's passage in his City Boy novel, where he says something along the lines of, how could I repay my mother for giving me life? The dilemma pushed on my conscience like a heart rock song. Uh, it was something like nobody gave her life, right? So the best that I could do was, be thankful for this and whatever, whatever it was. And I'm like, you know what? As I was reading the novel, I was like, that's going to be the beginning. That's going to be the beginning of the film. And it's just like it's not even a paragraph. It's a few sentences within a much larger paragraph that has something, it's about something totally unrelated. And yet these few sentences, I knew right away, I was like, this is the birth scene. This is going to be the first thing that Bruce Ario says in the film. And it's going to be a birth scene that is very unlike other kinds of birth scenes that you have. And then, of course, like within a few minutes, you literally have a funeral scene. So, in 8 minutes, that's extremely compact and compressed. A lot of stuff happens in terms of introducing you to his work, but also footage that I think, should be pretty arresting. Even if you're not really a film goer, like I can imagine people that they don't really watch films, let's say, and then they would watch this, and it is very different from things that you might otherwise see, and it might stick out to you for that reason alone.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, there's so many subtleties to directing, which I think most people who watch a movie are just completely oblivious to, like what angle the shots, what all of that. I'm impressed with all the foresight that goes into it. One question I had, a smaller question I had on that is, how did you go with the title? I'm assuming it was from that what Just As It Was, the his
Yeah,
Bruce Ario's poem.
yeah. So just as it was is one of Bruce Ario's great and best poems. So, and given the fact that okay, we're going to be getting a lot of footage, what is like some poetry footage that would be a little bit different from the ordinary? And I'm like, let's focus on, let's bring it back to ancient Turkey and focus on the moon. Right? Let's do moon imagery here. Let's play with the viewer in a way where you're constantly hinting at things related to the moon. And maybe like later on in the film, you sort of reveal the poem or you do something else. So in terms of unconventional images, I thought that would be a better choice. And also, I forget who it came from. Maybe Dan Schneider, because we were thinking about titles and we had a few, and that was one of them. And Dan Schneider, the literary executor of Bruce, who put together the selected poems, reconstructed the original version of the Cityboy novel, and so on and so forth. I think he was adamant on just do From There to There, Bruce Ario, the Minneapolis poet. So the subtitle gives you the name, right? Because it's a name that nobody would have heard of. Minneapolis is good because not a whole lot of poetry from what I was trying to like find. Not a whole lot of poetry has come out of Minneapolis, so this is like a way to differentiate the city. This is somebody that comes from the city, was forged by the city, very much is that city boy. And we're gonna we're gonna push not only him, but we're gonna push Minneapolis as a city in the same way that he did it in his life.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's so. I noticed that was a theme of City Boy. And reading through that, it's like the city was like one of the main characters of the story because he grows up and he's wants to be a city boy and he's doing all the things that he thinks a city boy should do. I wanted to talk to you a bit about that novel because it is not conventional in a lot of ways. Um, and I'm not sure I read it correctly because I think my tendency is to just read it as a novel, as like a regular novel. And part of the problem I had with it was trying to piece together exactly what was going on. Like for the first half, I think I was following pretty well because he's a child, so his world is very simply constructed, and so he's having all these ideas, but like I understand the framework. And then in the middle of the book, when he gets in the accidents and he goes off into other paths, I started losing track of what was going on because he didn't include grounding scenes. Like this is what his relationship to
Hmm.
his brother was like, or his father. Like so, because he's just often doing things and thinking about things. Um, so that would be a literary criticism in a way. But if I feel like that's misplaced, like he was going for something else, he was just going for some raw sense of authenticity. But what do you what are your thoughts on that? How to read this book?
Well, actually, when I read the reconstructed version for the first time, because before that there was this edited version that was going around that Bruce Ario allowed to like essentially get fucked up by a bunch of different editors. Bruce wasn't always like the most self-confident person. So he allowed, certain compromises on his art, and we're trying to restore it to the uncompromising, less palatable Bruce. It's very possible if you read that other like version that was kind of destroyed in many respects, it is in some ways an easier read because when I read the reconstructed version, my immediate thought was, okay, I immediately recognize this as a great book and better than the version that was going around previously. But despite the fact that it's a fairly short novel, it is a difficult read. Now, Joe Parrish, his the reason why it's difficult for him to read it is because me and Joe are much more kind of standoffish. We care a lot less about, scrutiny or opinions or whatever, or what people might say. Whereas Bruce Ario's narrator in the book, he's very much a people pleaser. He's so concerned about how others might approach him, or whether or not he's going to be successful in the city in the kind of maybe perhaps more traditional way that he's always wanted. And that kind of rubbed him the wrong way. For me, I was less concerned about that, and I was more concerned by the fact that it really is a very nice in to the way that an actually mentally ill person might think. Like, I think it's very common, for instance, that if you think about like, like, oh, I want to capture mental illness in a novel, how would that look like? And it's like you would have like totally incoherent paragraphs, or you might have random sentences coming in and out. And, like maybe like you have a page where it's just like random letters, like blah, 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 right? This is supposed to represent what's going on in my mind. But I've never been mentally ill, but probably that is not what mental illness actually looks like. It is probably a lot closer to what's happening in this book. So, for example, one thing that I think is a great sort of inversion of classical tropes in coming of age stories with, a boy who maybe has like romantic attachments to girls and crushes. I mean, everybody, every boy has that growing up. Uh, Whenever the word love appears in City Boy, and especially if it starts appearing a lot. on a page, something really bad is about to happen, right? There's like a section in the novel where he starts off a little like dispassionately talking about his interactions with prostitutes, the fact that he didn't see anything wrong with it, that these were like mature interactions and they were like, mature, compromises in the sense that we pay money, we give each other time, blah, blah, that sort of thing. But I remember how disturbing it was when in that same paragraph, he went off in this thing like there was nothing wrong with us to love each other in this way. He kept going on and on about love. It's like, wow, this is somebody that does not understand mature love. This is somebody that doesn't understand what actual romance is. I mean, he's literally going to prostitutes and he's talking about love. And then sure enough, like soon after that, the narrator goes completely off the deep end, gets arrested, and we are now more or less at the close of the novel. So if you pay attention to like what many novels previously have done, and you really compare it to what Bruce is doing, there's so many clever tricks. There's so many things that are happening that are they're not always necessarily the most pleasant read, but he's not bullshitting you, right? He's not throwing random little, snippets of things that don't go anywhere, right? He's not giving you dead ends. He's giving you an actual inside look into a fractured mind in a realistic way that's not condescending to mentally ill people and also does not really, exoticize or like orientalize them in some way.
Yeah. Okay. So, and that makes sense because Bruce Ario himself had this special how would you phrase it? His dis, dis mentally disabled, mentally
Well, he did have a traumatic brain injury. He eventually got after that diagnosed with schizophrenia. He had substance abuse issues and was eventually homeless for a time. So, whatever all those things cohere into, he had that. And when he speaks, if you see like interviews with him, either on my channel or elsewhere that he did, you could tell like there's something going on, right? He could be a very rational person. He's obviously, extremely intelligent and talented if he could craft all these things and do what he does. But you could tell like physically there's something going on. And I don't know, for instance, like when he would speak, it would seem like his like jaw was sort of like, working in the wrong way in some ways. And when I reread Cityboy, I was like, oh yeah, he talks about the jaw getting broken. I never asked him if that actually happened to him in real life, but if that did happen, if his jaw got broken in jail in his 20s, I could imagine something that looks a little bit like a speech impediment, right? Well into your advanced years.
right. So the to what extent is City Boy a veiled autobiography? Because my sense was this is Bruce.
He did say that something like at least 90 up to 95% of the things mentioned more or less happened to him. Other things, maybe some events were made up, maybe some things were changed around, maybe the order of events were changed, but it is more or less Bruce, it seems.
Yeah. Okay. Uh, so, what are your thoughts on the morality of the book? I thought that was an interesting angle looking through it because he wants to be a good person in a sense, like he has this encounter with the church and with Jesus, and so he wants to be made right by it. But he also, he has the DUI. He gets in the wreck. Like he's doing these things that he knows that he shouldn't do. Um, but I guess I'm thinking about this from a personal responsibility perspective because he has this mental illness going on, and yet he's doing these things he knows he shouldn't. Like what? How much is this a moral tale? I guess.
Well, I didn't speak to Bruce personally to really get kind of the timeline of some of the specific events. Like I never like sat down and be like, okay, really in your 20s, can you like give me a breakdown of what exactly caused you to do this or do that? But just judging by the book, so the timeline of events would be by the time that the narrator, puts this down on paper, or however you want to phrase it. I mean, that's just like a common conceit, right? Like did Ishmael in fact write Moby Dick because at the end of it he says that he was essentially shipwrecked and then he was discovered. But so like if we're gonna go to the idea that yeah this is Bruce writing this down, he would be in his mid 30s or so by the time that the events close. And by the time that you sit down and you write a novel like this, you you can't be spending a whole lot of time just fucking around, right? You can't be drunk driving at that point. You can't be just like doing nonstop drugs. You can't be homeless, right? So certain things in his life had to have come into order by the time that this book gets written down, right? That's another thing that I often talk about. This idea, this like romantic idea of art as like, these ideas just come into my brain and the novel comes fully formed. No, you sit down and you work hard every single day. Sometimes it takes you, 12 hours to get a page down. Sometimes it takes you 12 hours to get a paragraph down. Sometimes after 12 hours, you could get an entire chapter done, right? Who knows how it happens, but it always takes normal, consistent, everyday work. And he was very adamant about this. He would say, right now, my life is I volunteer, I have a 9 to 5 job. I live very much within my means. I'm able to purchase my own condo. I do, trips to Haiti, right, for mission work. When I see homeless people, being homeless myself, he says, I speak to them and I try to humanize them and I try to help them, but I don't give them money so that I don't incentivize their bad behavior potentially in the same way that I could have easily incentivized bad behavior if somebody gave me money to go drinking when I was, let's say, in my late 20s or early 30s. So there's a lot of complexity there, right? There was like a story from his life where if somebody at the thrift shop where he was working at was to come up to him and say, I don't have any money, can I get this thing? He would say, okay, I'll buy it for you. But if somebody were to go shoplifting, he would get angry and he would confront them, right? And he's also, he's a kind of in many ways like a standard Democratic Party voter, right? He was like a Democrat his whole life. So in that way, is like he's a kind of like a Minneapolis religious liberal, like everything that entails, like in that city, he is that. And yeah, complex opinions, a complex life. But I think it's very important to stress that by the time that a document like Cityboy comes out, by the time that it's in the ether, the person that put it together probably had his shit together at that point. And mid 30s or so, I don't think it's really out of the question that a human being, enters maturity at more or less that age, right? That I think is a common sort of experience, right? Where you have late bloomers, or even not even late bloomers. I mean, the philosopher Robert Grudin, he has his book Time and the Art of Living, and he has a line there that stuck with me, which was, in every kind of like epoch in my life, I thought that I was really getting old, but now in my 60s. I realized that I was in a twilight childhood until I was 35. I'm positive that when I'm in my 60s and 70s, I'll also think of my 30s as a kind of, childhood as well. So, yeah, it is important to remember that and to cut a little bit of slack, but also remember for a document like that to be out, that person had to work hard, right? So personal responsibility in the most radical sense, sit down and do this book, irrespective of there's no publisher. There's no money. I come home from work. Why am I doing this? Why am I slaving away after this book? No, you do it because you have to do it, because you can do it. It'll be much better than somebody else doing it. It's going to be a great document. Sorry, in that Nietzschean sense, you have no choice, right? I know that people have qualms about objectivity and morality. Sorry, if you're a great artist and you don't produce, you are a piece of shit. I'm sorry. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. Oh man. One thing that I appreciated with City Boy was um the kind of innocence that he had, even though we were just talking about his, the other things that he was doing, but like maybe he doesn't have his life together, but like he just really wants to be good, and that just it looks like something very unconventional, but it makes sense within his own head. So I think that was my favorite part of the book. Like I think it represented that really well. Um, so yeah. Oh shoot.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Sorry, I
he
thought that
does.
was leading into a
Yeah,
question. I lost my question, but any thoughts
well,
on that?
yeah, well, he does have that innocence, right? In the sense that, I mean, the book is titled City Boy, but of course, the irony is he is trying to grow into adulthood. And I think one of the lessons of the book is, as special as Minneapolis could be to Bruce, fact is, like all cities, and we say this in that 8 minute clip, right? All cities are more or less the same. The real mature Bruce would understand that, right? His experiences as unique as they were to him, There's probably some universal components, right? Especially when you go from city to city. And the real maturity is finding a real kind of symbiotic relationship between yourself, your youth, your city, your future, your past. And that also takes a lot of work, right? Again, he could not be on substances, he could not be homeless, he could not be unemployed, and have that kind of mature sort of I don't want to say self-possessed, right? Because he never really reached that stage of being self-possessed, but self-possessed enough in the way that truly matters, right? Which is the creation of great art. Because even if like some of these concerns and some of these flaws in his person maybe disrupted his day-to-day life, maybe he didn't always feel quite good about himself, those are personal issues. The bottom line again is, what are you producing, right? Beyond this like moping, weepy, whatever, right? What are you actually producing? Because no one's going to remember this part of you, but they will have this as a document, right? That they could get something out of, right? What can the world extract from what you're communicating?
Yeah, so that seems like a calling to some people. Like I've got this hidden art or whatever hidden inside of me, so it's my life's mission to bring it out. I feel like that's just embedded in some people, like, and they can't do anything besides that. Like you said, in the Nietzschean sense, they're forced to, which I guess is isn't with everyone, but it's especially strong in some. So
Hmm.
it's interesting the different kinds of personalities and what people latch onto just by being themselves.
Hmm.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you also about a more general question on poetry, because you brought up some people that as examples of influential poetry in your life. What would you recommend for someone like me who kind of knows of poetry, has a grasp on maybe some of the more classical things, but there's a lot of nuance, or there's a lot of new poetry that I don't know anything about. Yeah, where would you send someone like me?
Well, to your point, poetry really is, when you start really reading poetry, it is literally like learning another language, right? So I've had like these different phases in my life. Like I remember when I was on the train when I was a teenager and I first started reading, and I just had the happy idea of let me pick up Vladimir Lenin's The State and Revolution. And I was trying to read that on the train. And I remember 45 minutes passed from Coney Island to Times Square. That's the length of the trip. And I was sitting there reading the same paragraph over and over again. I'm like, what the fuck is this? I don't understand anything that's going on. Am I really just this stupid? How can I be this stupid? I'm not illiterate. I don't understand what's going on. So I was like, all right, if this is too hard, let me try something else. So I came home and I started with Leon Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed on his critique of Stalinism. And what I did with that book was I went through every single paragraph, and I did this like for a couple weeks straight. I went through every single paragraph in the book. I had index cards, and I would summarize each paragraph in my own words. I did this for every single paragraph in the book, and then out of curiosity, 2 weeks later, I cracked open The State and Revolution, and I'm literally reading it a paragraph, normally, like it's a fucking novel. And I was like, holy shit, I've had such a transformation, like something just literally just totally changed in my brain over 2 weeks just by this process. And the same
Hmm.
thing happened when it came to poetry. I remember like picking up Wallace Stevens when I was 16. I'm like, what? I was like, what the hell is this? I don't know anything with John Donne. Easier than Wallace Stevens, but still no idea what's going on most of the time. So I started to like pull back and I was all right. I know there's some poets that are easier. I randomly came across Countee Cullen. I would definitely recommend people, if you're totally new to poetry, just pick up Countee Cullen, right? He was a classic in his day. He's become more or less an unknown today, and he's definitely worth checking out. He's very understandable in the sense that he writes in the kind of a Keats lyric tradition, right? He has like poems praising Keats and whatnot. So rhyming, which is kind of like fun, right? I feel like if you want to pull somebody into poetry, rhymes are often a nice way to do that, at least for me, right? Musically speaking. So immediately understandable. He has more difficult stuff, but I would start there. Philip Larkin. right? Pretty conversational. There's Sylvia Plath might not be the best example, but there's some pretty understandable stuff with her. Emily Dickinson, right? Obviously a classic, very easy to apprehend right away. Some of the best stuff. A lot of people say Walt Whitman, but I will say that when I was in high school, Walt Whitman came up in our, like English courses and whatnot. And I was not impressed with him then because at that point it's like, oh, I'm reading William Butler Yeats, and the thoughts seem like so much more complex. And I really did not appreciate Walt Whitman until years later. Now it's Song of Myself is one of my favorite poems. His poetry is like some of my favorite. Some of the lines that are always like clattering around in my head, they come from Whitman. But that kind of, almost conversational biblical style, that took a long time to appreciate. Same thing also, I mean, I was a religious Christian at some point, but I never actually appreciated the Bible as art until much later in life after, I became an artist. Now, some of my favorite books, like the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Job, right? These are literally some of my favorite books. And they're of the Bible. So it takes a while, I think, to start to really appreciate some of the more conversational stuff. So I mean, it's like a mix of stuff, right? There's definitely difficult poetry, but even among the classics, if you read enough of it, it does really open up like a new language. There are people in this world that they could be extremely smart. They could be, even like, reading tons of prose, but you put them, you put some Wallace Stevens in front of them, they will literally never be able to get it because maybe the window has passed, right? Maybe you do have to start a little bit early on, maybe at least in your 20s, maybe in your 30s, that you have to really start thinking about it. But there's a way to finagle it. Just like with learning a new language, you're probably not going to start with, a classic text of French literature if you don't know how to say your own name, right? So it all just takes work, and a lot of it is just kind of give and take and compromising and figuring out as you go along.
Oh, yeah. Oh man, I love that story, by the way, with Lenin and Trotsky. To me, like it drives home the point, like reading poetry is like a muscle that you have to exercise and work your way up, and then you get to partake of the fruits, as opposed to pulling out some, advanced poetry and like fill my soul, like it doesn't work that way.
Mhm.
So, all right. Well, I think that's about the end of the questions that I had. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about? Anything we might have missed?
Well, I have my literary magazine that's automachination.com. I always regret now saying that word in public because I have to spell it, right? I
Oh,
start spelling it, I start messing up the spelling. It's a word that I made up, so nobody ever heard of it. But now they have to go there to actually find my material, right? Which is unfortunate. But again, it's one of those uncompromising features of Alex Sheremet and my universe and Bruce Ario and everything else. So I have a literary magazine, right? So we publish stuff usually a few times a week. It's film reviews, it's poetry. People sometimes have stories. Like I said, Bruce Ario wrote for the magazine before. My website and as well as my YouTube channel, Automachination, right? We have conversations like this. Sometimes I have video essays. Sometimes I have something else altogether. Sometimes I'm literally just walking around the city with a camera in my face, just talking for an hour about something on my mind. I found that I was able to do that. I am able to just literally walk and have a full-blown conversation just like this and not get lost. And if anything, I think it's a very nice way of concentrating, right? I don't know if it's true, but the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam, he said that he would walk around and write poetry in his head as lines would come to him before it ever hit paper, and often would not hit paper simply because of Stalinist repression and that sort of thing. Personally, I find that kind of crazy. Like, I can't imagine just being able to have a sufficient number of lines just as I'm walking without paper. Sometimes I do have my phone out and I'm literally typing a poem as I'm writing. Some of my best lines actually have come to me in the last couple of years just on walks. And I'm like, damn, I got to write this down. But a full-fledged poem, I probably do have to sit down and get it out there. So yeah, this is some of my material. There is a GoFundMe also for the film, because it is really self-funded, right? It's me and Jill Parrish. We were like, we don't know if this thing would ever make any money, but fuck it, we're going to put X number of dollars and throw in, go to Minneapolis, split any profits 50-50, all expensive 50-50. And if we make money, great. If we don't, so be it. We have a great film, which is what matters. But people have been generously donating. So if you Google GoFundMe plus from there to there, Bruce Ario, the Minneapolis poet, you will find it if you want to contribute. And hopefully, when the full release is out and we have DVDs, it's going to be DVD release in the vein of like the golden age of DVDs, right? Where it's like, okay, I'm going to go out and get this DVD and they're going to have tons of extras, right? We're talking like hours of interviews and all the stuff that you don't really get anymore in bare bones releases, but we want to bring it back to the people. So that's where our head is at.
Oh, cool. Yeah, well, I can put I'll include links in the description so they can get to the GoFundMe, the Auto Machination YouTube site, YouTube channel, and your website. 'Cause
Mhm.
yeah, it's interesting stuff. Um, and now the film also you don't have a release date yet, but it's this summer.
Yeah, I am hoping to do a screening as a first screening in Minneapolis this summer. And this kind of like wider because there's also the issue of some of the rules regarding film festivals and how to submit that sort of thing. I don't know exactly if some of these places want to see like DVDs first before something is shown there, but I will have like a wider screening, and there's probably going to be stuff available for patrons. Like we already have the 8 minute thing up for the first 8 minutes, at least a rough cut of the film for patrons. And we're going to have a 37-minute rough cut coming up for patrons sometime next couple of weeks as well. So people that have been following, right, we're getting like little drips of the work in progress. And if there's any, substantive changes afterwards, I think it's useful, right? If we decide to make some kind of change, it's because we believe that it's for the better. And if you have a before and after, that's another kind of blueprint for your mind. Like, okay, they made these decisions. Are they correct or incorrect? Right? What is the evidence in the film here? What is the evidence in this newer version of the film? So hopefully people could engage with it in that way too.
Yeah, cool. Well, I'm interested to see what happens because, like I said, you had me on the 8 minutes. Like, yeah, it was interesting. So, I appreciate that. So yeah, I'll include all the links, and I'm gonna keep an eye on that for when it gets released. So yeah, thanks so much for joining and talking about poetry. Like that was fascinating to me as a non-professional poet.
Well,
Or
not yet, right? It's very possible that you Countee Cullen and your life changes too in totally incomprehensible ways, right? Which is my hope. So thank you.
yeah,
Yeah. So thank you for having me. Thank you for some stimulating questions, and I'll definitely keep you abreast of any developments. And I mean, we both have channels. I'm always looking for people to do some kind of shows on different books, right? That's one thing, right? Get people that read watching, so we could cross-pollinate in that way too.
yeah, that'd be fascinating.
Well,
All right.
have a good night. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks again. We'll talk to you later.